The encounter that started it all. The city bus roared to a stop, its grumbling engine protesting as if weary from years of relentless service. The faded blue paint along its sides bore the scars of time, scratches, dents, and the occasional patch of graffiti. It hissed open its doors at the corner of Madison and Elm, where a thin stream of passengers filed on board, each carrying their own stories, worries, and dreams. Among them was Nia Thompson, a 16-year-old with sharp, inquisitive eyes that missed little and a warm smile that rarely dimmed, no matter the weight she carried. Nia's backpack, a battered olive-green relic handed down from her older cousin, hung heavy on her shoulders. Inside it was everything she needed for school and for survival. A well-worn notebook, a tattered novel she loved, and a small pouch of coins she'd saved from skipping lunch for days. Her shoes, scuffed and too tight, were a testament to her family's struggle to make ends meet. As she stepped onto the bus, the driver nodded to her, recognizing her as one of the regulars. "Hey there, Nia. Long day." "Always is," she replied with a grin that masked her exhaustion. She maneuvered through the crowded aisle, dodging elbows and bags. Her usual seat near the middle was taken, so she kept moving, finally finding a spot near the back. She let out a sigh of relief as she sank into the hard plastic seat, leaning her head against the window. The bus shuddered forward, rattling over potholes and weaving through the late afternoon traffic. Nia gazed out the window, the world blurring into streaks of gray and gold as the setting sun cast its glow. She thought about her mom, who was likely on her second job by now, cleaning offices in the downtown district. Her little brother, Mason, would be at home, probably trying to finish his homework while sneaking bites of cereal, their dinner for the night. Nia's stomach tightened at the thought, but she pushed it aside. The bus jerked to another stop, and a wave of new passengers crowded in. Among them was an elderly woman, small and frail, clutching a wooden cane and wearing a pale lavender sweater that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her hair, a snowy halo beneath a knit cap, framed a face etched with the lines of many years, yet her eyes sparkled with an undeniable vitality. Nia noticed her immediately. The woman stood gripping a pole for balance, swaying slightly with each lurch of the bus. Around her, passengers remained glued to their phones or stared blankly into space, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to her struggle. Nia hesitated. She was tired, her legs ached, and the thought of standing for the rest of the ride made her shoulders slump. But her mom's voice echoed in her mind, firm yet gentle. "Always do the right thing, even when it's hard." Taking a deep breath, Nia rose from her seat and waved the woman over. "Ma'am, you can take my seat," she said, her voice loud enough to cut through the hum of the bus. The woman's head turned sharply, her expression shifting from surprise to gratitude. "Oh, bless you, child," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. She shuffled over, leaning heavily on her cane, and eased herself into the seat. "Thank you. You're very kind." "It's no problem," Nia replied, gripping a nearby pole for balance as the bus started moving again. She smiled down at the woman, who returned it with warmth that seemed to radiate through the chilly atmosphere of the bus. "What's your name, dear?" the woman asked after a moment. "Nia," she said, glancing at her out of the corner of her eye. "And you?" "I'm Mrs. Eleanor," the woman said, adjusting her scarf. Her hands, veined and delicate, rested on her cane. "It's rare to see young folks with manners like yours these days." Nia chuckled softly. "My mom wouldn't have it any other way." "Your mother raised you right," Mrs. Eleanor said, her gaze lingering on Nia's frayed backpack and worn shoes. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. The bus jostled over a particularly rough patch of road, and Nia tightened her grip on the pole, swaying with the motion. Mrs. Eleanor patted the seat beside her. "Sit for a moment. Let me hold that bag of yours." Nia hesitated but relented, lowering herself onto the edge of the seat. She handed over the backpack, and Mrs. Eleanor held it carefully, as if it contained something precious. Heavy, she remarked, her tone light. You're carrying quite a load. Nia shrugged, her smile tinged with weariness. Just school stuff. And dreams, I imagine, Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice softer now. Big ones. Nia blinked, surprised by the woman's perceptiveness. How'd you know? Oh, I can see it in your eyes, Mrs. Eleanor said, her gaze unwavering. You've got that fire in you. The kind that pushes you forward, no matter how hard things get. Nia felt her throat tighten, and she looked away, out the window. The streets blurred past, familiar landmarks fading into the background. I guess, she said quietly. But sometimes, it feels like too much. Mrs. Eleanor reached over, her hand light on Nia's arm. Dreams are like seeds, child. They need care, patience, and faith to grow. And sometimes, they need a little help. The bus slowed to a stop, and Nia realized they were nearing her neighborhood. She stood, retrieving her backpack. Thanks, Mrs. Eleanor. It was nice talking to you. Wait a moment, the woman said, rummaging through her purse. She pulled out a small crisp envelope and pressed it into Nia's hands. Take this. It's for you. Nia stared at it, confused. What is it? Something that might help, Mrs. Eleanor said cryptically, her smile soft but insistent. Promise me you'll open it when you get home. Okay, Nia said, tucking the envelope into her bag. The bus came to a halt, and she stepped off, glancing back at Mrs. Eleanor, who waved at her from the window. The bus pulled away, disappearing into the evening traffic. As Nia walked home, the envelope felt heavier with each step, as though it carried more than just paper. She had no idea what lay inside, but something in Mrs. Eleanor's gaze told her it was more than she could have imagined. A letter beyond expectations. The creak of the old townhouse door greeted Nia as she stepped inside. The scent of warmed leftovers and Mason's overenthusiastic attempts at a science experiment filled the air. She kicked off her too tight sneakers and hung her backpack on the wall book. The envelope tucked within its depths tugged at her thoughts like a persistent whisper. Nia. Mason's voice rang out as he came barreling into the hallway, his hands coated in flour and something sticky. Guess what? I made the volcano erupt. It was so cool. Slow down, she said, laughing as she dodged his outstretched, messy hands. Mom's going to flip if you ruin another shirt. Mason grinned, his gap-toothed smile a mix of innocence and pride. She already said it was fine, but you have to come see it later. Sure, later, Nia promised. Mason bounded off, already chattering to himself about modifications for the next explosion. In the kitchen, their mom stood at the counter, her hair tied back, and her expression tired but kind. A stack of papers from one of her jobs lay to the side, and the smell of warm stew filled the room. Hey, baby, her mom greeted without looking up, sliding the pot lid back on. How was school? Same as always, Nia replied. She hesitated, her mind flashing to the envelope. I met someone interesting on the bus today. Her mom paused, glancing over her shoulder. Interesting how? Just someone kind. She gave me something. Said it might help. Her mom's brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Be careful with strangers, Nia. People don't always have good intentions. I know, Nia said, and she meant it. But something about Mrs. Eleanor had felt genuine, like warmth radiating from a fire on a cold night. Later that evening, after Mason had gone to bed and the house had settled into a hushed stillness, Nia sat cross-legged on her bed, the envelope in her lap. The edges were crisp, the paper thick and expensive feeling. She traced her fingers over the unmarked surface, her heart pounding with curiosity and unease. Finally, she tore it open. Inside was a handwritten letter, the kind of penmanship that spoke of time and care. The words sprawled across the page in deep, looping strokes. Dear Nia, in life, we meet people who remind us of why kindness matters, why resilience is worth cultivating, and why dreams should never be ignored, no matter how far away they seem. Today, you reminded me of all these things. I've lived a long life, full of joys and challenges, and in you I saw a light, a determination I've seen in only a few. It reminded me of someone very dear to me, someone whose dreams didn't get the chance to blossom the way they deserved. I've spent years trying to honor her memory by giving to others who carry that same spark. And Nia, I believe you do. Enclosed, you'll find a small gesture, a scholarship in her name, a step toward your future. Use it wisely. Use it boldly. The world needs people like you, Nia. People who believe in their dreams enough to chase them, no matter how difficult the path. Thank you for your kindness today. It may seem small to you, but it meant the world to me. Keep that kindness in your heart. It will carry you farther than you can imagine. With love, Mrs. Eleanor. Nia's hands trembled as she set the letter aside, revealing the second item in the envelope, an official-looking document embossed with gold lettering. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes skimmed over the words. Maria Eleanor Memorial Scholarship, $10,000. She stared at the amount, her mind spinning. The certificate was real, genuine in a way that left no room for doubt. $10,000. Enough to cover most of her first year of college. Enough to give her dreams of becoming a doctor a foundation. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of excitement and disbelief surging through her veins. Her dreams had always felt like fragile glass, beautiful but at risk of shattering under the weight of reality. But now, they felt more tangible, as if someone had handed her the first brick to build the life she'd always envisioned. Nia grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she searched for the contact information listed at the bottom of the letter. She found the number and hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. What would she even say? How could she possibly thank someone for a gift this profound? Instead, she pressed the number into her contacts and saved it. Tomorrow. She'd call tomorrow. For now, she needed to process what had just happened. The next morning, the world felt a little different. The air seemed lighter, the sunrise brighter. Nia clutched the envelope as she walked to the bus stop, her steps more purposeful than they'd been in months. She couldn't wait to tell her mom. Her dreams, her real dreams, suddenly didn't feel so far away. But as she sat on the bus, her mind swirled with questions. Who was Mariah, the daughter Mrs. Eleanor had mentioned? What had happened to her? And why had Mrs. Eleanor chosen her, a girl she'd just met, for such an incredible gift? The weight of those questions lingered as the bus rolled down the familiar streets, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Nia felt a pull. A need to understand the story behind the letter, behind Mrs. Eleanor's kindness. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. And Nia wasn't going to let it go unanswered. Nia spent the entire bus ride replaying the events of the previous day in her mind. The letter, the scholarship, and Mrs. Eleanor's warm yet mysterious demeanor stirred something within her. It wasn't just gratitude. Though she felt it deeply, it was a sense of responsibility, a desire to honor the gift by learning more about the woman who had bestowed it upon her. Her curiosity outweighed the lingering sense of disbelief. The questions burned in her mind. Who was Mariah? What happened to her? And why me? As the day wore on at school, Nia found it harder to concentrate. Her teachers' voices became background noise, her thoughts drifting back to Mrs. Eleanor. By lunchtime, she had made up her mind. She would call the number in the letter as soon as she got home. The final bell couldn't come fast enough. When it finally rang, Nia bolted out of her last class and practically sprinted to the bus stop. The ride home felt interminable, each stop dragging on as her anticipation grew. She clutched her phone tightly in her pocket, her thumb rubbing over its smooth surface like a nervous tick. When she got home, the house was quiet. Her mom wouldn't be back from work for another hour, and Mason was at a friend's house. Nia dropped her bag by the door and sat cross-legged on her bed, the phone and letter in front of her. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves, and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a familiar, gentle voice answered. "Hello, this is Eleanor speaking." Nia's heart leaped. "Hi, Mrs. Eleanor. This is Nia, the girl from the bus yesterday." A brief pause was followed by a delighted chuckle. "Nia, I was hoping I'd hear from you. How are you, dear?" I'm good. Really good, actually," Nia said, her voice trembling slightly. I wanted to thank you. For everything. The letter, the scholarship. I don't even know how to put it into words." "You don't have to, dear," Mrs. Eleanor replied warmly. "I could see in your eyes that you'd understand the gesture, and I hoped it would help you take a step closer to your dreams." "It will," Nia said earnestly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you, though." "Repay me?" Mrs. Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh, child, kindness isn't about repayment. It's about passing it forward. That's all I ask of you. When the time comes, pass it forward." Nia nodded, even though Mrs. Eleanor couldn't see her. "I will. I promise." There was a pause, and then Nia ventured, "Can I ask you something? Who was Mariah?" The letter said the scholarship was in her memory. The line was quiet for a moment, and Nia worried she had overstepped. But then Mrs. Eleanor spoke, her voice carrying a mix of sorrow and warmth. "Maria was my daughter," she said softly. "She was bright, kind, and full of dreams, just like you. She wanted to be a doctor, to help people in ways that truly mattered. But she passed away when she was just a little older than you are now." Nia's breath hitched. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Eleanor replied. "It's been many years now, but I keep her memory alive through this scholarship, helping young people like you chase their dreams. It's what she would have wanted." Nia felt a lump rise in her throat. "She sounds amazing." "She was," Mrs. Eleanor said, her tone softening. "And so are you, Nia. That's why I chose you. I see the same fire in you that Maria had, the determination to overcome whatever stands in your way." For a moment, Nia couldn't speak. Her thoughts swirled with a mixture of emotions, gratitude, sorrow, and a deep sense of connection to a woman she barely knew. Finally, she managed to say, "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Mrs. Eleanor said with quiet conviction. "And remember, if you ever need anything, guidance, support, even just someone to talk to, you can call me anytime." "I will," Nia promised. As they said their goodbyes and Nia hung up the phone, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The scholarship wasn't just money. It was a legacy, a piece of Mariah's dream, handed down to her, entrusted to her. Nia sat on her bed, staring at the letter and the scholarship certificate. The weight of Mrs. Eleanor's kindness and trust pressed on her shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a responsibility, a calling. She thought about what Mrs. Eleanor had said. Pass it forward. It wasn't just about achieving her dreams anymore. It was about ensuring that the kindness she had received would ripple outward, touching lives just as hers had been touched. Nia smiled to herself, the first real, unrestrained smile she had worn in weeks. She didn't know exactly how she would repay this gift yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She would honor it with everything she had. A legacy unearthed. Days turned into weeks, and life resumed its familiar rhythm for Nia. School assignments piled up. Mason's science experiments grew more elaborate, and her mom worked tirelessly to keep their small family afloat. But something had shifted within Nia, a spark of determination she hadn't felt in years. Every night after finishing her homework, she would pull out the letter and scholarship certificate from Mrs. Eleanor. The words on the page reminded her that her dreams were no longer just distant aspirations. They were possibilities. But with that possibility came a gnawing curiosity about Mariah, the young woman whose memory had inspired such generosity. One Saturday afternoon, Nia found herself alone at the house. Her mom had taken Mason to a community center event, leaving Nia with rare quiet time. She sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The letter from Mrs. Eleanor lay nearby, and her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Nia hesitated. Was it intrusive to search for information about Mariah? But the more she thought about it, the more she felt compelled to understand the woman who had inspired such a profound act of kindness. With a deep breath, she typed into the search bar, Mariah Eleanor Foundation. The results appeared instantly. The first link led to a sleek website with a banner image of a young woman smiling brightly, her arms folded confidently in front of her. Naya's breath caught. This must be Mariah. Maria's photo radiated warmth and strength. Her dark hair was styled neatly, her eyes sparkled with intelligence, and her smile was the kind that seemed to light up a room. Below the photo was a brief biography. Mariah Eleanor Foundation, honoring dreams, empowering futures. Mariah Eleanor was a compassionate and ambitious young woman who dedicated her life to helping others. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, believing in the power of healing and community care. Tragically, Mariah's life was cut short at the age of 20 due to a car accident. Her family established this foundation in her honor to provide scholarships to students pursuing careers in medicine, keeping her legacy alive through the dreams of others. Nia's eyes lingered on the words. She could almost hear Mariah's voice, urging her to push forward despite the obstacles in her path. Mariah's story resonated deeply with her, amplifying her own resolve to succeed. She clicked through the website, learning more about the foundation's work. The scholarship she had received was part of an annual initiative, awarded to students who demonstrated not only academic promise, but also a commitment to kindness and community service. Nia couldn't help but feel humbled to be part of something so meaningful. That evening, Nia decided to call Mrs. Eleanor again. She needed to thank her properly and to ask about Mariah. With her mom and Mason still out, the house was quiet as Nia dialed the familiar number. "Hello, Nia," Mrs. Eleanor answered, her voice warm and cheerful. "What a lovely surprise." "Hi, Mrs. Eleanor," Nia said, her nerves settling at the sound of her voice. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all, dear. What's on your mind?" Nia hesitated, then plunged forward. "I was reading about the foundation today. I saw Mariah's picture, and I just wanted to know more about her." There was a pause, and when Mrs. Eleanor spoke again, her tone was softer, filled with both fondness and a trace of sorrow. Maria was extraordinary. From the time she was a little girl, she was always helping others. She used to bandage her dolls with toilet paper, pretending to be their doctor. And as she grew up, she turned that play into a real passion. She volunteered at shelters, tutored younger kids, and even started a community health initiative in high school. "She sounds amazing," Nia said, a lump forming in her throat. She was. Mrs. Eleanor agreed. She had this light about her, this way of making everyone feel seen and valued. When she decided to pursue medicine, I couldn't have been prouder. But her voice faltered for a moment. Life had other plans. Nia's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Eleanor. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." "It was," Mrs. Eleanor admitted. "But the foundation has been my way of channeling that grief into something meaningful. Knowing that Maria's legacy lives on through young people like you, it brings me comfort." Nia felt tears prick her eyes. "I'll do my best to honor her memory. I promise." "I know you will," Mrs. Eleanor said. "And remember, Nia, your journey isn't just about reaching your own goals. It's about the lives you'll touch along the way." Over the next few days, Nia couldn't stop thinking about Mariah. Inspired by her story, she started looking for ways to contribute to her own community. She began volunteering at the local library, helping younger kids with their homework, and organizing book drives for families who couldn't afford new supplies. One evening, as Nia walked home from the library, she saw Mrs. Eleanor sitting on a bench at the corner of her street. The older woman smiled as Nia approached, her cane resting beside her. "Good evening, dear," Mrs. Eleanor greeted. "Out changing the world already?" Nia laughed, a little embarrassed. "Just trying to help where I can." Mrs. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "That's how it starts. One small act at a time." They sat together for a while, the streetlights casting a soft glow over the quiet neighborhood. Naya told Mrs. Eleanor about her volunteering and how she hoped to expand the library's tutoring program. Mrs. Eleanor listened intently, nodding with approval. "You're building something beautiful, Nia, and you're doing it with the same spirit Mariah had. She would have been proud of you." Nia looked down, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you. That means a lot." As they parted ways that evening, Nia felt a deep sense of purpose settle over her. She wasn't just chasing her dreams anymore. She was carrying forward a legacy, one that would continue to grow and inspire others. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so far away. It felt within reach. The ripple effect. The cool air carried the first signs of autumn, the leaves rustling as Nia walked to her next tutoring session at the library. The days had grown shorter, but her schedule seemed to stretch endlessly. Between school, volunteering, and helping Mason with his projects, her time was packed. Yet, she found herself energized in a way she hadn't been before. Each step she took felt purposeful, every moment a piece of a larger puzzle. Mrs. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind often, one small act at a time. Nia hadn't realized how much those words would reshape her approach to life. The library bustled with its usual mix of activity when she arrived. Children scampered between shelves, clutching books twice their size, while adults sat hunched over laptops, their faces lit by the glow of the screens. In a corner of the community room, a small group of students waited for her. "Miss Nia," called Alina, a bright-eyed fourth grader who always asked the most questions. "Are we going to do fractions again today?" Nia laughed, setting down her bag. "We are. And I've got a fun game to make it easier." Alina groaned dramatically but grinned, clearly eager to learn despite her protests. The other kids gathered around, their chatter filling the room with a warm hum. Nia loved these moments. Watching the kids' faces light up when they grasped a new concept filled her with pride. She could see glimpses of their potential, just as Mrs. Eleanor had seen hers. After the session, as the last of the students left, a librarian approached her. Mrs. Jenkins, a kind woman with a penchant for colorful scarves, carried a clipboard. "Nia, do you have a moment?" she asked. "Of course," Nia replied, packing up her materials. "I've noticed the wonderful work you've been doing with the kids," Mrs. Jenkins said, her tone warm. "We've had parents coming in to thank us for the program, saying their children are showing real improvement." Nia felt a rush of pride, but kept her composure. "That's great to hear. The kids are the ones doing the hard work. I'm just here to help." "Well, you've done more than help," Mrs. Jenkins said, tapping her clipboard. "I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in expanding the program, maybe organizing a weekly workshop for older students who need help preparing for high school entrance exams." The suggestion caught Nia off guard. She hadn't considered taking on more responsibility, but the idea excited her. It was another opportunity to make an impact, to push herself further. "I'd love to," Nia said after a moment. "What would it involve?" Mrs. Jenkins explained the details: a larger group, more advanced topics, and potentially a small stipend for her time. Nia listened carefully, nodding as ideas began forming in her mind. "Let me know when I can start," she said, her determination evident. That evening, Nia returned home to find her mom sitting at the kitchen table, a rare moment of rest between her two jobs. Mason was upstairs, likely tinkering with his latest project. Nia joined her mom, dropping her bag by the door. "You're home late," her mom said, sipping tea. "Busy day." "Yeah," Nia said, sliding into a chair. "The library wants me to expand the tutoring program. They said I'd get a stipend for it." Her mom raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's wonderful, Nia. I'm proud of you." "Thanks," Nia said, hesitating for a moment. "You know, it's all because of Mrs. Eleanor. She's the one who believed in me first." Her mom leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "That woman is something special. Not everyone goes out of their way to lift others up." Nia nodded, her thoughts drifting to the scholarship and the story of Mariah. "She told me to pass it forward. I'm trying to do that." "You're doing more than trying," her mom said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "You're making a difference." Over the next few weeks, Nea threw herself into the expanded tutoring program. She spent hours crafting lesson plans, researching effective teaching methods, and organizing materials. The first session drew twice as many students as she'd expected. The group was diverse, kids from all walks of life, each with their own challenges and dreams. Nea quickly realized how much the program meant to them. For some, it was a chance to catch up on subjects they struggled with. For others, it was a safe space where they felt encouraged and supported. The room buzzed with energy as students asked questions, worked through problems, and cheered each other on. One evening, as the session wrapped up, a boy named Jamal lingered behind. He was quiet, always sitting at the back and rarely speaking unless called on. Nea noticed him hesitating near the door. "Everything okay, Jamal?" she asked, her voice gentle. He nodded but didn't meet her eyes. I wanted to say thanks for doing this." Nea smiled. "Of course. You're doing great, Jamal. Keep it up." He shuffled his feet, then looked up at her. "I never thought I'd be good at math, but you make it." "I don't know. Not so scary." Her heart swelled at his words. "That's the goal," she said. "And trust me, you're better at it than you think." Jamal smiled shyly before hurrying out. Nea watched him go, a sense of fulfillment washing over her. These moments reminded her why she worked so hard. Every student she helped was another ripple in the pond, a small act that could grow into something far greater. That night, as she walked home under a canopy of stars, Nea thought about Mariah. She wondered if Maria had felt this same sense of joy when she helped others, if her dream of becoming a doctor had been driven by this same desire to uplift and heal. By the time she reached her front door, Nea had made a decision. She would write to Mrs. Eleanor, not just to thank her again, but to share how Maria's legacy was already taking root in her own life. She would tell her about the tutoring program, about the students who were flourishing because of her kindness, and about the way Maria's story had inspired her. Nea sat down at her desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write. The words flowed easily, each one carrying her gratitude and determination. She wrote late into the night, pouring her heart onto the page. When she sealed the envelope and addressed it to Mrs. Eleanor, Nea felt a sense of completion. She didn't know what the future held, but she was certain of one thing. She would honor Mariah's memory every step of the way, just as Mrs. Eleanor had hoped. Nea held the sealed envelope in her hand, staring at it for a moment before slipping it into her backpack. The simple act of writing to Mrs. Eleanor had filled her with a sense of peace, but also renewed resolve. Tomorrow, she would drop it in the mail and hope it conveyed the gratitude and determination she couldn't fully express in person. The following morning, as the city buzzed with its usual weekday rush, Nea made her way to the post office. The streets were alive with the chatter of vendors, the rhythmic hum of car engines, and the occasional bark of a dog. The weight of the envelope in her bag was both comforting and heavy, like a promise she was about to send out into the world. At the post office, she waited in line, shifting from one foot to the other. When her turn came, she handed the letter to the clerk, watching as it was stamped and placed into the outgoing mail pile. It was a small action, but one that felt monumental. As days passed, Nea poured herself even deeper into her tutoring program. Word had spread throughout the community about the workshops, and more students began showing up each week. The library staff worked with her to secure additional space, and Nea found herself stepping into a leadership role she hadn't anticipated. One evening, after a particularly successful session, Mrs. Jenkins pulled Nea aside. "Nea, I've been talking to some colleagues about what you've accomplished here," she began. "We think your program could serve as a model for other community centers in the area. There's a conference coming up, and I'd like you to present your work." Nea blinked, caught off guard. "Me? Present at a conference?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her smile reassuring. "Absolutely. You're the heart of this program. Nia, who better to talk about it? Nia's initial reaction was a mix of excitement and nerves. She'd never done anything like that before, stand in front of a room full of strangers and speak about her work. But as she thought about it, she realized it was an opportunity not just for her, but for the kids she was helping. If sharing her story could inspire other communities to implement similar programs, it was worth stepping out of her comfort zone. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm with resolve. Preparing for the conference became Nia's new challenge. She spent hours creating a presentation, gathering feedback from Mrs. Jenkins and other library staff. She even practiced in front of Mason, who gave her surprisingly helpful critiques in between bouts of teasing. "You gotta smile more," he said one evening, munching on a bag of chips. "You look too serious, like one of those boring teachers." Nia threw a pillow at him, laughing. "Thanks for the tip, little man." When the day of the conference arrived, Nia stood nervously at the entrance of the community center where the event was being held. She clutched her presentation materials, scanning the bustling crowd of educators, librarians, and community organizers. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself. "You've got this." When it was her turn to speak, Nia stepped up to the podium, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the audience. Then she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nia Thompson, and I'm here to share the story of a program that started with a simple goal: to help kids in my community succeed." She spoke about the challenges many students faced, from limited resources to the pressures of balancing school with family responsibilities. She shared stories of the kids she had worked with: Elena, who had learned to love math, and Jamal, who had gained confidence in his abilities. With each story, she felt her confidence grow, her passion shining through. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Nia's heart swelled as people approached her afterward, asking questions, expressing admiration, and sharing their own ideas for similar programs. One woman, a director from a neighboring community center, clasped Nia's hand and said, "You're an inspiration. We've been struggling to start a tutoring program, but after hearing you, I know it's possible." Nia left the conference feeling exhilarated, her mind racing with new possibilities. She realized how far she had come, not just as a student or a volunteer, but as someone who could lead and inspire others. A few days later, as Nia was leaving the library, her phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, is this Nia?" came the familiar, warm voice of Mrs. Eleanor. Nia's heart lifted. "Mrs. Eleanor, hi, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I received your letter," Mrs. Eleanor said, her tone filled with pride. "And I can't tell you how much it moved me. You've done so much in such a short time, Nia. Mariah would be so proud." "Thank you," Nia said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just wanted you to know how much your kindness has changed my life, and the lives of others." Mrs. Eleanor was silent for a moment, then said, "You've turned that spark into a flame, my dear. And it's lighting the way for so many. Keep going, Nia. You're just getting started." As Nia walked home that evening, her heart felt light. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a single act of kindness on a crowded bus to a growing movement of hope and opportunity. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but she also knew she had the strength to face them. Maria's legacy wasn't just a memory anymore. It was alive, growing stronger with each life Nia touched. And for the first time, Nia truly believed that the dreams she had once considered out of reach were closer than ever. A chance to dream bigger. Autumn deepened, the once green leaves now a vibrant tapestry of gold and crimson. The crisp air carried the scent of change, and for Nia, life seemed to mirror the season's transformation. The success of her tutoring program and the inspiration from the conference had ignited a spark within her, a desire to dream bigger, to expand her reach beyond her small community. One evening after a long day of school and tutoring, Nia sat at her desk, staring at her laptop. She had been researching scholarship opportunities and programs for aspiring doctors. The words pre-med and medical internships filling her search history. Each page she clicked on made her pulse quicken with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The possibilities seemed endless, but so did the obstacles. The screen's glow illuminated her small room, cluttered with textbooks, sticky notes, and Mason's science projects that had found their way onto her desk. Nia absent-mindedly twirled a pen between her fingers, her mind drifting back to Mrs. Eleanor's words. One small act at a time. She took a deep breath and typed an application for a prestigious summer medical camp in her state. The program was competitive, accepting only a handful of students each year, but it offered invaluable experience in medicine. Nia poured her heart into the application, detailing her passion for helping others, the inspiration she drew from Mariah's story, and the impact of her tutoring program. Weeks passed, and the business of life kept Nia distracted from the outcome of her application. Her program at the library continued to grow, with new students joining every week. She even started collaborating with local teachers, aligning the tutoring sessions with classroom curriculums to maximize the students' success. One afternoon, as Nia was organizing materials in the library's community room, Mrs. Jenkins approached her with a broad smile and an envelope in hand. "This came for you, Nia," she said, handing over the envelope. It was thick, with a return address she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside was a letter bearing the official letterhead of the summer medical camp. She scanned the words, her breath catching when she read. "Dear Nia Thompson, congratulations. We are thrilled. Consider it part of Mariah's legacy," Mrs. Eleanor had said when Nia tried to refuse. "You're carrying her dream forward." On the day she left for the camp, Nia stood at the bus station with her mom, Mason, and Mrs. Eleanor, who had come to see her off. The cool morning air carried a sense of anticipation. "You've worked hard for this," her mom said, hugging her tightly. "Remember, you belong there." Mason gave her a playful nudge. "Don't forget to take pictures of anything gross." And Mrs. Eleanor, with her ever-gentle demeanor, placed a hand on Nia's shoulder. "Keep that fire alive, Nia. You're destined for great things." As the bus pulled away, Nia waved to her family and Mrs. Eleanor until they disappeared from view. She felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This was the first time she'd be away from home, and the weight of the opportunity she'd been given was heavy. But she also felt ready. The foundation she had built, the kindness she passed forward, had led her here. The camp was everything Nia had dreamed it would be. Each day was filled with hands-on workshops, lectures from renowned doctors, and simulations that tested her problem-solving skills. She learned to take vitals, practiced suturing on models, and even shadowed surgeons in operating rooms. But beyond the technical skills, Nia found herself drawn to the human aspect of medicine. She listened intently as patients shared their stories, their resilience inspiring her. She realized that being a doctor wasn't just about treating illnesses. It was about connecting with people, understanding their struggles, and offering hope. One evening, during a quiet moment in her dorm, Nia wrote a letter to Mrs. Eleanor. She told her about the camp, the lessons she was learning, and how Mariah's story continued to guide her. By the end of the camp, Nia had not only gained valuable knowledge, but also a renewed sense of purpose. She returned home with a plan, to work even harder, to seek out more opportunities, and to keep building on the foundation that Mrs. Eleanor and Mariah had given her. Nia stood at the threshold of her home, her heart brimming with gratitude and determination. She was no longer just a girl with a dream. She was a girl with a plan, a purpose, and the belief that she could make a difference, one small act at a time. A legacy of light. The months following Nia's return from the medical camp were a whirlwind of activity and growth. Armed with new skills, fresh insights, and a reinvigorated sense of purpose, she threw herself into her studies, her tutoring program, and her plans for the future. The camp had been transformative, but it was just the beginning. Nia knew her journey was far from over. There was so much more she wanted to accomplish. Her acceptance into the camp had not only validated her dreams, but also sparked a sense of possibility among those around her. Teachers began encouraging other students to apply for similar opportunities. Parents asked Nia to speak to their kids about her experiences, and the library's tutoring program blossomed into a community-wide initiative. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into something much larger, a movement fueled by hope and determination. One crisp winter morning, Nia received an unexpected call from Mrs. Eleanor. Her voice was warm, but there was an urgency beneath it that Nia hadn't heard before. "Nia, dear, how are you?" Mrs. Eleanor began. "I'm great," Nia replied, smiling. "Just busy with school and the tutoring program. How about you?" "I'm doing well, thank you," Mrs. Eleanor said. There was a pause, and then she added, "I was wondering if you could come by my house this weekend. There's something I'd like to share with you." Curiosity sparked in Nia's chest. "Of course, I'd love to." That Saturday, Nia arrived at Mrs. Eleanor's home, a cozy brick house surrounded by a garden that seemed to bloom even in the winter chill. Mrs. Eleanor greeted her at the door, her floral scarf draped elegantly over her shoulders. Come in," she said, ushering Nia inside. The living room was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of lavender and the soft hum of classical music. A framed photograph of Mariah sat on the mantel, her radiant smile a constant presence in the house. Mrs. Eleanor guided Nia to a chair near the fireplace, where a small table held a stack of papers and an old leather-bound journal. "I wanted to show you something," Mrs. Eleanor said, sitting down across from Nia. She picked up the journal and held it delicately, as if it were a fragile treasure. "This belonged to Mariah. It's her journal." Nia's eyes widened. "Her journal?" "Yes," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice soft. "She started it when she was about your age. It's full of her thoughts, dreams, and plans for the future. I've been holding on to it all these years, but now, I think it's time to pass it on." Nia's breath caught as Mrs. Eleanor extended the journal toward her. She hesitated, her hands trembling. "Are you sure? This is so personal." Mrs. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I'm sure. Maria's dream was to make a difference, to inspire others. I believe she would want you to have this. You remind me so much of her, Nia." Tears welled in Nia's eyes as she took the journal, the leather cool beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what to say." Mrs. Eleanor smiled. "Just keep being you, Nia. That's all I ask." That evening, Nia sat at her desk, the journal in front of her. She opened it carefully, the pages filled with Mariah's neat handwriting. Each entry was a window into Mariah's mind, a mix of heartfelt reflections, sketches of medical equipment, and detailed plans for community health initiatives. One entry, dated just months before Mariah's passing, caught Nia's attention. "Dreams are fragile things, but they're also resilient. Every time I feel like giving up, I remind myself why I started. It's not just about me. It's about the lives I want to touch, the people I want to help. If I can make even one person's life better, then every struggle will have been worth it." Nia closed the journal, her chest tightening with emotion. Maria's words resonated deeply, echoing her own feelings about the tutoring program and her dream of becoming a doctor. She felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just to honor Mariah's legacy, but to build upon it. Over the following weeks, Nia found herself returning to the journal often. It became a source of inspiration, a reminder of the power of dreams and the importance of perseverance. Maria's words guided her as she began planning the next phase of her tutoring program, a mentorship initiative to pair older students with younger ones, fostering a cycle of learning and support. The idea quickly gained traction. With the help of Mrs. Jenkins and other community members, Nia organized workshops to train high school students as mentors. She also secured funding for new resources, including laptops and textbooks, through local grants and donations. The program's impact was immediate. Students who had once struggled with confidence began thriving, their mentors providing not only academic support, but also encouragement and friendship. Parents expressed their gratitude, and Naya saw firsthand how a single idea could ripple outward, transforming lives. One evening, as Nia walked home from the library, her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Eleanor. It was short but heartfelt. "You've done more than honor Mariah's memory, Nia. You've expanded it. She would be so proud." Nia stopped in her tracks, staring at the message. Tears filled her eyes as she typed her response. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor. I couldn't have done any of this without you." As the months turned into years, Nia continued to grow, her journey shaped by the kindness and guidance she had received. She graduated high school at the top of her class, earning a full scholarship to a prestigious university's pre-med program. Her tutoring and mentorship initiatives expanded into neighboring communities, creating a network of support for students across the city. And through it all, she carried Mariah's journal with her, a constant reminder of the legacy she had been entrusted with. Each page was a testament to the power of dreams, the strength of resilience, and the impact of kindness. One day, years later, Naya stood in her own white coat, a stethoscope draped around her neck, as she prepared for her first day as a resident doctor. She glanced at the journal on her desk, the edges worn from years of use, and smiled. "Thank you, Mariah," she whispered. "I'll keep passing it forward." And with that, she stepped into the next chapter of her journey, ready to continue the legacy of light that had been passed to her so many years ago.